Hello, everyone. It's really tempting to say good evening because it's evening here, but you're from all over the world. So, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and good night. Um, Thank you for joining us for our final Lacan in Scotland event for um, this semester or this term before we go into the summer recess. We will be back in the autumn in September, but for the first half of the year, this is us. Big thanks tonight for Sheldon George for joining us and for agreeing to talk with us and to present for us. Um, Sheldon is the chair of English at Simmons University in Boston. Um, I myself first encountered Sheldon in Colorado about, must be 4 or 5 years ago, at a Lacan conference where I was blown away by Sheldon's clarity. As you'll all have attended many conferences, people presenting on Lacan and Lacanian ideas, and you'll probably share my experience of finding many of the presentations quite difficult to follow in the oral format. Sheldon really shone for me because he was incredibly easy to follow in an oral format. His presentation was so lucid, so clear, and beyond his clarity on Lacan, he made me want to go away and read Toni Morrison again, which was a real achievement because I'd given up on Toni Morrison many years before that. So double thank you to Sheldon and triple thank you for coming along tonight. It's a real pleasure to have you, and I'm personally very much looking forward to hearing you speak. Sheldon's going to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then, as Amanda said, after that, we'll open things up for discussion. Okay, without further ado, over to you, Sheldon.
Okay, good day, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Calum. I'm glad you were able to read some Morrison. Next to Lacan, Morrison is my favorite kind of reading. Well, perhaps Morrison more so than Lacan, who truly enjoys reading Lacan. Anyway, it's great to see so many of you here who I know, some familiar faces, especially my old pal Derek Hook there, who presented for us last time. My presentation will be through PowerPoint, and hopefully this is as lucid as Calum's past experience has been. It's a complicated topic. It's sexuation. It's probably, it's one of the more difficult Lacanian concepts, if we can imagine anything in Lacan that's not difficult. But hopefully my application of it to race will make some sense to you. So let's start with the slideshow. I'll share my screen. Okay, so so thanks again to Calum and to Lacan in Scotland. The title of my talk is Racialization and the Sexuated Lacanian Subject. We know, of course, that Lacan rarely discussed race, but I want to argue that his thinking about sexuation allows us to better understand race in ways that Lacan himself didn't actively theorize. Race, we should be clear, cannot be collapsed with sexuation, nor can sexuality. But I will suggest that race intersects with sexuation. Broadly speaking, sexuation is an unconscious choice about how we experience jouissance or enjoyment. Sexuation is a response to lack, or we may say that it is the particular way that lack splits us as subjects in pursuit of jouissance. It's our unconscious choice about how we enjoy after the body is carved up into zones of enjoyment tied to the drive. And it's also about establishing repeated unconscious modes of enjoyment at the levels of the signifier and the psyche. But race, on the other hand, is a fantasy object of the symbolic. It's what Kalpana Audrey Crooks has called a master signifier. Race is purely symbolic, but it has extra symbolic effects. Some of those effects is that are that it inscribes both the body and the ego, and it also impacts the drive. So the core parallel that I find between race and sexuation is that both mediate our relation to lack and jouissance. This is Lacan's graph of sexuation. It outlines 4 possible positions the subject can take up in relation to jouissance. I read race as a mediator of jouissance. Race mediates jouissance. Race establishes a relation to jouissance, helping to position subjects in relation to each of these 4 coordinates outlined in the formulas at the top of Lacan's graph. So I will describe race through reference to these 4 subjective relations to jouissance. And I will also touch on the bottom portion of the graph as I progress, specifically as I talk about racialization. At the center of this image in yellow, I provide a key for reading the top half of the graph. In looking at the key, we see an inverted A that represents all. The phi correlates with phallic. The reversed E represents the hyphenated word exist. And here, this particular way of writing exist points to Lacan's sense that we're talking about something that both exists and insists from outside of the symbolic. So it's not regular existence, it's something that is outside of the symbolic. And then finally, we have the minus sign that represents negation. So those terms help us to translate these formulas. I'll give more detail as we progress, but at the bottom is what the Greek formulas say when translated in this way. You'll note that I invert the order of the translation in the left-hand column. I translate the lower left formula first, just because it's a little clearer to understand what Lacan is saying. So the translations would read, starting with the inverted A, x, phi, x. That translates as all jouissance is phallic jouissance. And the implication that Lacan is putting forth here is that because all jouissance is phallic jouissance, jouissance comes up short. But then in the next formula, Lacan suggests that there exists a jouissance that is not phallic jouissance, or that the subject believes that there is this jouissance that is not phallic jouissance, and that therefore will not come up short. On the other side, the right-hand side, and this is the side that Lacan associates with woman, we get there doesn't exist a jouissance that is not phallic jouissance. The implication here being that this jouissance only exists. That is, it exists outside of the symbolic. And then finally, not all jouissance is phallic jouissance. So that's the translation. And I hope you're still following me. This is the really technical part of the talk. All right. So if we start with the bottom left side of the graph, we read, all jouissance is phallic jouissance, and so it comes up short. What does this mean? Well, it starts with Freud's notion of the subject as polymorphous perverse. able to derive pleasure from all sources. This pleasure is restricted by subjectivity itself and also by sexuality, according to Freud. So here we are talking about sexuality, not sexuation. For Freud, heterosexuality is indicative of the ways that civilization restricts the jouissance or the enjoyment of the naturally polymorphous perverse subject. Freud states, as regards the sexually mature individual, the choice of an object is restricted to the opposite sex. The requirement demonstrated in social prohibitions that there shall be a single kind of sexual life for everyone disregards the similarities, whether innate or acquired, in the sexual constitution of human beings. It cuts off a fair number of them from sexual enjoyment and so becomes the source of serious injustice. Now, Lacan expands this reading, tying the restrictions on jouissance both to the signifier and to the body. These restrictions allow us to find two versions of the Lacanian subject in Lacan's work. Lacan describes both a subject of the signifier, or the well-known subject of desire, and a subject of the drive. These subjects, and indeed all subjects, only experience a jouissance that comes up short. The first reason jouissance comes up short is because it's curtailed by the signifier. The desiring subject of the signifier is what Lacan describes in his veil of alienation. Now, this is an image that comes from the Four Fundamental Concepts, Seminar 11. This subject, this desiring subject, is a subject who loses access to a certain jouissance or pleasure upon encountering the signifier of the symbolic. The veil is an either-or choice, either or, in which both options lead to a loss. It's similar, Lacan famously tells us, to the robber demanding your money or your life. You give up something valuable to gain a life of meaning under the signifier, right? So Lacan, the meaning of Lacan's image here is that we gain meaning through the signifier, but we lose something that Lacan calls being. And roughly translated, you could define being as libido or as jouissance. But where it's impossible to regain this lost jouissance, the signifier of the symbolic becomes the cause of jouissance, Lacan tells us. The signifier creates what Lacan calls a surplus jouissance, or a phallic jouissance. So that's, this is where the notion all jouissance is phallic jouissance comes from, right? So the signifier creates what Lacan calls surplus jouissance or phallic jouissance. This phallic jouissance is tied to both the signifier and fantasy. Why is it phallic? In Western society, the phallus is often seen as a source of jouissance. It grounds a fantasy of complementarity, where two can combine to make one, where our mate can complete us, right? That's what we always say, I fell in love, I found my soulmate, she completes me, or whatever. So it's a search for this jouissance bound to complementarity that fuels desire in its aim of filling lack in the symbolic. And so all jouissance is phallic jouissance. But there is also an indestructible jouissance that Lacan ties to the subject of the drive in his myth of the lamella. So we've discussed the subject of desire, now we're shifting to the subject of the drive. The lamella is the pure, irrepressible life force that the subject loses through the very process of embodiment. So embodiment deprives you of jouissance, right? It restricts polymorphous enjoyment to certain zones of the body. This indestructible force emerges as the partial drives because it's channeled into these zones. It gathers at the orifices and the rims of the body. So embodiment then is the second reason why jouissance comes up short. But this irrepressible force is yet still channeled or redirected. It becomes the source of what Lacan calls in the Four Fundamental Concepts, the headless subject of the drive. So this is a subject that doesn't have the same connection to consciousness because it doesn't work in the same way through the signifier. Right, so the subject, the desiring subject is connected to the signifier, but there's a different relation to the signifier when we get to the drive, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But here we have a headless subject because the subject isn't working through consciousness, if you will. So this framework allows us to now start to understand the top left portion of the graph. Here we have the formula that reads, there exists an other jouissance, or we can say a jouissance of the other that is not phallic jouissance and will not come up short. Lacan says that we insist on the existence of this other jouissance. And to be clear, Lacan uses the word other in two ways when speaking of jouissance. At times he calls feminine jouissance other jouissance. That's not what I'm talking about right now, right? I'm not talking about feminine jouissance. This is a jouissance that is tied to an embodied other, right? Like a racial other. So the signifier, we've said, only grants surplus jouissance or phallic jouissance. And the libido only emerges as partial drives through the channels of the body. But both the drive and desire insist on an other jouissance that they cannot circumscribe, an inapprehensible jouissance that must exist. This jouissance is both other to the subject, that is absent from them, and in the subject's fantasies, it is also possessed by the other. So this is why it is the other's jouissance. What the drive constitutes is what Lacan calls a headless subject whose relation to jouissance is in actuality driven by the other. Lacan's formula for the drive is barred subject in relation to the demand of the other. So here the signifier emerges in a different way now, right? This formula indicates that the barred subject navigates its emptiness of being, which is represented by the lozenge, the sort of square, inverted, tilted square at the center of the formula, through interpreting the demands of the other. So the barred subject navigates its lack through interpreting the demands of the other, which of course are articulated often through signifiers, but also through actions. So the subject seeks to meet the demands of the other, a parent, for example, because the subject perceives in the other a mode of enjoyment that they can emulate. They can access enjoyment by mimicking the other. Here we already start to see the impact of the symbolic and a signifier like race upon the drive. What we emulate is a mode of enjoyment that brings pleasure for the other in whose steps we follow. A mode that may extend to racist acts and that promises to compensate for our sense of lack. Here, I would say that racism, the racist act, becomes an expression of the drive. Because jouissance is alienated from the subject, it is also an other jouissance, as Lacan says. It is always an other jouissance that stirs us. So this is where race fits in. So the title of my talk announces a focus on both sexuation and racialization. Race, I would say, becomes a source of self-identification or of racialization because it promises access to an other jouissance. Lacan states that it's insofar as the other intervenes that the subject will apprehend a jouissance that is beyond the homeostasis of the pleasure principle and beyond the partial drives. My suggestion is that the subject apprehends an other jouissance when the subject circles race as the object A of the as the object A or the fantasy object. So here in this image, you see I've replaced or I've inserted race as a version of the object A, as the object, the fantasy object, that the drive circles as it leaves the body, and then it leaves the rim of the body and then re-enters the body. So race involves a form of identification we can call after Lacan soul loving. This is a term that Lacan uses in Encore. In this identification, the A masquerades as the amorphous absence in the self, the absence in me that simultaneously constitutes the soul of the other. This A can lead the subject to love the other as a lost soul, as a soulmate, if we want to simplify Lacan, or apprehending this lost object in the other can lead to hatred of the other, who has what I lack. So you experience yourself as lacking, you turn to a soulmate to fill you, or you turn to the racial other as someone who causes your lack. So race therefore signals the presence in the other of an other satisfaction that the subject insists has to exist. We can see racism then as an insistence that is agitated by the drive, as the drive circles race as the ghostly fantasy object that must exist in the other. It's this insistence that makes race a narrative that, in Lacan's words, never stops not being written, in both our fantasies and in the symbolic. Race details a narrative about the subject's pursuit of a jouissance that must be. But as Lacan says, this is also a jouissance that shouldn't be, because our fantasies of its existence make all the pleasures we do experience seem paltry in comparison. What's the source of race's power? I would say race diminishes other forms of jouissance because in race, there is a collapsing of the A with the signifier of the lack in the other, which Lacan writes as S parenthesis barred A. Lacan describes this collapsing of the A with the signifier of lack in the other in his discussion of courtly love, where the woman, who he says does not exist, stands in the place of a certain divinity. There's something divine about her. She both embodies the A that is absent from us and represents a transcendence that we worship. The A in her stands as the semblance of a being that is all ultimately removed from us. This barred A, as signifier of the other, is both a representative of the barred unconscious, that is, the unconscious that is other to the subject, and also the representative of the thing in the beyond that we so love. So woman stands in this dual position as an image of the A, but as also an access point to the beyond. Lacan ties the barred A to God himself as the divine soul from the beyond that in religion we are alienated from. God is absolute being, whereas the A is merely a semblance of being. So my modification to the bottom of the graph suggests that race's power is that it functions as this object A, and that the raced subject can manifest the signifier of the barred other. Now, to be clear, the signifier of the barred other signifies both the unconscious and God, who sort of represents or embodies this beyond thing that is absent from us, right? So race stands in that place where it has this sort of level of divinity. So the A creates a race subject that doesn't exist, which is why I cross out race the way Lacan crosses out woman. Through this A, we animate the other of our fantasies, granting them a soul that we worship or we scorn. There's something simultaneously godlike and scornful in the figure of the Black rapist, for example, who was lynched for taking the white man's object A, his white woman. This figure attained a divine sort of completion by having the A. He manifested the lost phallus, which is at the bottom left in Lacan's graph. But he was also scorned for impeding an impossible complementarity that sustains fantasies of whiteness. The lyncher experiences what Lacan calls, and I don't speak French, so I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but eine amoration, or hate love. With racism, we hate love the one who has the object that completes us. And we do so because they are both somehow divine by virtue of having the A, and also unworthy of its possession. It is the interplay between hate loving and soul loving the A and the other who possesses it that fuels our relation to identification. Racial identification is about, to recall Lacan's words, identifying with or disavowing the other and the subjectifying symbolic space that the other prepares for us. So what do I mean by that? At the most basic level, I would say taking up a racialized identity means finding a place for yourself in a pre-established picture with which you are urged to urged to identify. Lacan shows in Seminar 11 how this subjectifying place can relate to the nothingness of your lost jouissance. He tells a story of his young, heady days when he took time off from being a student by trekking into the seas with his friend Petite Jean, who's involved in the cannon industry. Out at sea, Lacan sees a sardine can that his friend tells him does not see him. A can to which Lacan is, quote, nothing. So I know you're confused by this slide. This is my masterful rendering of Lacan and Petite Jean seeing the sardine can. That's the sardine can over in the right in silver. Lacan spots it from across. I don't know which one is Lacan and which one is Jean, but it really doesn't matter. But anyway, Lacan, we're told, looks like nothing in the picture because he is out of place in the world in which he vacations. He describes the can as a point of light that I align with the libido, or with lost jouissance, the absent lack in Lacan. He presents consciousness itself and his own fantasies of hanging with the poor as a stain in the picture. Consciousness is a stain in the picture. It's a spot that would usually block the iridescence of the real that this can represents. Here it fails to block it, right? So Lacan is confronting his nothingness. He's confronting the real. But in his usual state, he's more like this. So here is my second rendering of Lacan in the sardine can. This is an image of Lacan you may have seen on the internet. Here, the triangle is the iridescent light of the real that shines from the can that's positioned to the right. Note how it's blocked also by the phallic cigar that is masking Lacan's nothingness. Now, Lacan ultimately aligns the stain that blocks an iridescence with what he calls coloration in animals. Of course, you'll note that Lacan is tanning. He's adding some coloration of his own to his skin. And he's also painting himself into the picture of an upper class leisure identity, right? Which is why being out fishing becomes so problematic for him. Lacan suggests the possibility that coloration is an adaptive mimicry in response to environment. But he ultimately dismisses that coloration has anything to do with mimicry, saying that mimicry is about a subject becoming muddled in an environment that is muddled. But to me, this mimicry seems tied to the masquerade that differentiates men and women as being and having the phallus. I read race as a kind of mimicry in which we start to see in the skin a coloration that is really not there. People become black and white, colors that they literally cannot be. There are literally no black and white people in the world. The skin itself becomes a mask, what Lacan calls a paper tiger, that masquerades as a source of supremacy or lack. The skin is cathected, existing at the threshold of the iridescent real and the external world. On the sexuated body, it is the entry point of the returning drive. But racialization isn't only about the drive that functions at the level of the headless subject. It's also about the signifier that functions at the level of the subject of desire. Becoming raced means embracing a discourse that attempts to name your absent iridescent being. Race names being. In the instance of the letter, Lacan makes an important divergence from Saussure that enables us to see this. By using the double image of two doors instead of Saussure's single tree, which is on the left, he shows that it is the signifiers gentlemen and ladies that grant meaning to the signified, to the identical doors in this case. Here, the signified is the polymorphous perverse drive of the sexuated being. This drive is directed through the door of gender toward the channels of a particular sexual identity. In the same way that the signifier dictates the sexual drive, race as signifier also channels the libidinous drive. The signifier, we can say, racializes the drive through its domination over the signified. So what you get is a process where the signifier names what is inside the subject. Race names your being. So race and racialization are inextricably bound to racism and trauma, especially in the lives of African Americans. And here I just have a few more slides. I want to present trauma in line with Lacan's graph as a confrontation with a jouissance that does not exist. The top right of the graph reads, there doesn't exist a jouissance that is not phallic jouissance. Instead, there exists outside of language a jouissance that is not phallic jouissance. A jouissance that we cannot say a word about. Now, if we remember that true jouissance, as opposed to mere phallic jouissance, means both unbearable pleasure and unbearable pain, then taking on race can mean experiencing a jouissance that does not exist in the symbolic, one that exists as trauma outside of what we can articulate with words. It's this kind of trauma that was experienced by Lucy McBath and Ron Davis. You can see Lucy in front of the microphone trying to put words to her pain. She and her husband are the parents of Jordan Davis, who was killed in 2012 when Michael Dunn, a 47-year-old white male, shot 10 bullets into an SUV where Davis and his friends played loud music. This is a traumatic incident that can not only kill the body, but also shatter the psyches of those who witness it. And we should think about what it means for us as an audience to witness all of these recent scenes of violence against especially Black men, but also Black women. But I want to end by suggesting how trauma can also lead to the experience of a jouissance beyond the phallus in a way that is curative. In the final portion of the graph, Lacan says, not all jouissance is phallic jouissance. Here he is presenting woman, and here he's talking about feminine jouissance. He's presenting woman as not solely subjected to the phallic function. And at the end of seminar 11, Lacan imagines the possibility that after the decimation of the fundamental fantasy, after confronting the fact of lack, the subject may experience the jouissance of the drive, a non-phallic jouissance. He says this is the beyond of analysis, and it has never been approached. But I would suggest that it is precisely this beyond that Lacan seeks to approach in the Santhome seminar. The Santhome involves a splicing together of the symbolic and the real. This splicing occurs when the subject accesses an unconscious know-how, a savoir-faire, all their own, and in the process manifests this savoir-faire as the driving force of their actions. I propose that this may be what this woman did. Congresswoman Lucy McBath, the mother of Jordan Davis. McBath ran on a gun control platform and was elected to the House of Representatives in the Democratic wave that swept the 2018 midterms. Through her political savoir-faire, she confronted the overwhelming trauma of her loss. And she now, it seems, mediates a jouissance that once only existed in the real, existed in the real. If she suggests the possibility of reaching beyond a fantasy of race, the possibility of attaining what Lacan calls the beyond of psychoanalysis, then maybe psychoanalysis needs to move beyond its traditional neglect of race. In his seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, Lacan makes a rare mention of race. He discusses two African patients of his, whose unconscious, Lacan claims, shows no signs of their tribal customs and beliefs. Not only does Lacan not find race in their psyches, but he, in effect, charges the students of the seminar to not look for race in their future patients, stating that psychoanalysis, quote, cannot be used to conduct an ethnographic inquiry. Now, whether or not psychoanalysis can reveal ethnography, it is clear, I think, that it still has much work to do to reveal race and its centrality to the psyche. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Sheldon. Again, you lived up to the lucidity that I was expecting, so thank you for that. Very interesting, and I'm sure we've got lots of questions from the floor. Sheldon, I'm going to start off. It's like a question that's kind of, I guess, kind of nagging at me throughout your presentation, this kind of connection. And you're very clear at the beginning that when you're talking about race and racialization and sexuation, that you're not trying to create some kind of you're not trying to read one exactly in terms of the other. You're utilizing sort of mechanisms of Lacan's to open up an understanding. So I'm not trying to pull you back into that equalization here, but I wonder, with the way I understand Lacan's graph of sexuation, and particularly the commentary he gives it on it himself within the seminar, seems to suggest a non-fixity, that he's not talking about these sexed positions as absolutes, that he talks about them in terms of a choice. And I imagine at the time Lacan was giving his seminar, that was quite an unusual, controversial idea, but it's an idea that seems to have found its time now in the first half of the 21st century, and the idea of a sex position being something fluid, and the whole question of gender identity and the ability to choose gender or question gender and shift between gender positions is something that is not universally accepted, but is quite widely accepted now.
Right.
But as soon as we start to take that idea and apply it to race, it seems to me to become as controversial now as what Lacan was saying in terms of gender may have been in the early 1970s. And certainly, speaking personally, I have difficulty understanding that use of the graph in terms of race. And I think you kind of speak to this idea in the second half of your presentation, where you bring it into contemporary experiences and the very clear examples you give, and we can go through so many examples of particularly Afro-American men who've suffered so hideously and violently, and that's projected onto the world stage as being, you know, seemingly very, very rightly a question of race. So to come back to I think my question is maybe slightly obvious now. That how do we square that circle in terms of Lacan? You're utilizing a graph here that seems to point to a non-fixed position, and yet we seem to it seems to be in reenacting of violence to say that race is something we can simply and easily step in and out of. I mean, easily is the wrong word there, but the idea that race is something we can shrug off seems to be a reinscription of a violence that we're already experiencing too much.
I don't quite follow you. How is it reinscripted?
Reinscribing the violence in the sense that we are diminishing the race position by saying it's something that we can move out of. We can choose whether we're race, and maybe some of us can choose the extent to which our race position is a significant part of our identity, and some of us can't.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things I would say. In terms of the structure of the graph itself, I think part of what Lacan is doing is sort of giving us the limited ways that we can enjoy. What I'm suggesting is that race comes in and structures enjoyment so that it falls into one of those categories, right? So race coincides with different forms of enjoyment. But part of my argument is that the way that race works, and particularly the way that racism works, is that it latches on to the drive. And Lacan associates the drive with this headless subjectivity. For me, what that means is that we have moved past conscious efforts, right? We've moved into the level of the unconscious. And part of what Lacan is talking about with his formula for demand, right, is that it's the signifier of the other that structures our his formula for the drive. It's the signifier of the other that structures our drive. So what's happening is that the social, historical, cultural interaction with the symbolic inflects the drive. Now we know that the drive doesn't have an object, right? But what happens is that the drive starts to circle race. It starts to circle this fantasy object, and it gives that fantasy object a sort of fantasized solidity. It gives it a sort of rigidity. And that's why race becomes this narrative that is always told, right? That's why it is the story that can never stop not writing itself, because it follows this circular pattern of the drive, right? But that movement that I'm making toward the end of the discussion, where I'm talking about Lucy Bath and my sense that perhaps, she allows us to think about the possibility of transcending the fantasy structure of race, right? I don't think that's something we easily do, right? And the history of race in America and in the wider world suggests that it's not something that we easily do, right? And you never completely transcend race. Part of my argument, this essay, this talk sort of builds out of an essay that will appear in the new book that Derek and I are working on. Part of what I argue there is that it is pleasure that structures the unconscious, right? It is jouissance that structures the unconscious. And if that's the case, then the unconscious that is structured like a language is also structured by exposure to the jouissance of racism. The implication there, the broader implication, is that we become unconsciously racist. And that is despite our race, if you will. You know, a Black person becomes racist against a Black person because it's an unconscious process that is tied to the signifier. And so, you know, it's a struggle to get past race. There's nothing easy about it.
Okay, I could keep going and talking to you all night. This is fascinating and enlightening and very, very important. But we have lots of other people who want to ask you questions, so I'm going to stop talking now and open up the floor. So first of all, we have Prabha.
So first of all, thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful talk on race and Lacan's formulation on sexuation that he talks about in his seminar 20, end quote. So if I have understood you correctly, race and racialization are to be read in conjunction with the concept of object petit a that you were talking about. So doesn't that automatically imply that the persistence of racism and also the construction of racial identity is going to be forever? I mean, doesn't that also imply that race is going to stay here forever? And since objectivity is also the object around which desire revolves forever, but it cannot be achieved. It is never attainable. And also because you mentioned the insistence of race, which automatically becomes a part of the drive. And you just really mentioned that we unconsciously become racist. So my question is something like that. It's more like a comment, I guess.
That's a great question. Yes. So race, I'm suggesting, takes on the function of the fantasy object, takes on the function of the object A. And part of what I'm showing in that modification of Lacan's image of the drive, the arrow, is the sense that race takes on this function as object A. But the reason that race is able to take on the function of object A is because, as Lacan says in the Four Fundamental Concepts, that the object A can be any object, because the object A marks the place of a hollow. And so what we see in the slide I showed with Lacan and the sardine can, where the sardine can unveils an emptiness, a hollow in Lacan himself, is that what is involved for Lacan is a masking of this hollowness. So race functions as a way of masking lack, but it's not the only thing that masks lack. And there is nothing inherent in race itself that makes race the object that has to function as the object A. I think it has been, because of our history, our historical understanding of race has been hyper-cathected. But there is nothing about race that makes it necessarily an object of exaggerated difference. And that's what it is, right? Race is an object of difference, but so is hair color, so is height. But our history has made race, the importance of race, exaggerated, right? And in the end, I think race is a way of seeing. And there are different ways of seeing the world. If you guys are from all over the world, And there are different understandings. I grew up in the West Indies, where the majority of people are either of African descent or Indian descent. So when you talk about race, you're not really talking about white people in a direct way. So there's a slightly different understanding of difference, right? So I think one argument I would make is that what white people need to understand is that race exists. Race is real because race leads to racism. Broadly speaking, what Black people need to understand is that race is not real. Race is a fantasy. And so, yeah, that's the conundrum. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's where we are, right? We've bought into this concept that structures our identity, that racializes our drive, right? You know, we see it on display in America. The drive has become racialized. It's the death drive expresses itself through racial acts, racial violence. So what you have is the drive being inflected by the signifier.
Thank you so much.
That was incredibly eloquently put, Sheldon.
Thank you.
So, John.
Hi, Dr. George. It's nice to speak with you. I guess I'm wondering how you're imagining the difference between subject positions in your form of thinking. That is, right, when you talked about object A and the signifier of Lacan the other, it was very much from the white subject position. But how would these sorts of Lacanian dynamics between object A and the signifier of the Lacan the other function? From the perspective of Black subjectivity, or from the perspective of let's say white Hispanic or Black Hispanic subjectivity. Like, how are you, like, outside of a dichotomy between white and Black, how are you imagining these things? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could talk about that in detail because it's kind of hard to be that specific. I think I can't talk about specific groups and how they fall into these subcategories. I think what we see, for example, with the George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin case is the ways that Hispanic identity, Zimmerman is partially Hispanic, can sometimes collapse with whiteness, right? And how he can identify as a white man. So I think there's a lot of nuance there, but I do think that, Kalpana Sasodri Crooks makes the argument that whiteness is a master signifier. And so in a way, whiteness is what structures the system. It's like you have white and then you have colored. And that doesn't, I don't think that quite answers your question. I'm not sure that I can. My particular focus has been on African Americans, and if you read my material, you'll see that it tends to be, this talk was particularly abstract, but my work tends to be very focused on historical, thinking theory through history. So there's more specificity in the writing than in the talk itself.
Thanks, Sheldon. Next up, we have Sexuated.
Hello, am I audible?
You are?
Okay. Good evening. So I have a little bit of question that is, especially in the countries which are having their experience of post-colonial days, especially since, say for instance, if the countries have discovered their freedom now, even after their freedom, they go on persisting in the same kind of racial pleasure-making mechanism. They cannot in any way change their position from being to having or from having to being. Why do these things happen? Why can't they take a kind of lesson from this in order to stop this kind of loop? This is my question.
Can you repeat the last sentence? What was the final question?
Actually, I wanted to say that when a country achieves its freedom, then also it indulges in the same kind of racism from a counter discursive way. Why does this happen? Why can't they stop it? Why can't they take a lesson from it?
I think you're sort of asking me, how do we end racism? The part of what I'm showing here is that there is enjoyment that's attached to racism. People gain pleasure through racism, and that's why the structure repeats, right? That's why we emulate the structure of racism. So this is what I was saying in terms of the child who learns to access pleasure in modes of enjoyment that repeat the patterns that they inherit from their parents, right? I think the same thing or something very similar happens with colonialism, where there's a sort of structuring of the symbolic that is still in place, a structuring of a symbolic of race that's still in place, right? And it's a structuring that's based on a hierarchy. What it then means is that even if whiteness is not present in a visible way, then near whiteness may be present, right? So, as I said, I grew up in the West Indies, where what's prized is light skin. So the same structures of enjoyment repeat themselves, and they repeat themselves precisely because they're enjoyable. And here it's important to keep in mind too that when we say enjoyment, we don't mean simply pleasure. We're talking about enjoyment in terms of jouissance, which is about excess. It's about a pleasure that transforms into pain, right? Like Freud tries to figure out why is it that someone who sees a pattern of abuse in their family will end up with an abusive man. It's because they're responding at the level of jouissance, and they're responding at the level of patterns of behavior.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Miguel.
Hi, Sheldon.
Miguel.
Yeah, I'm doing well. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for the talk today.
Sure.
And so my question has to do with the status of the drive in relation to the schema that you've set up. And because if I'm understanding your argument correctly, as you make it today and as you've talked about in your written work, when we're thinking about these different acts of racism, they're at least in part done to sort of prop up this kind of phantasmatic wholeness, right? This fantasy of whiteness when we're talking about the UX context. And but and I'm very, very interested in the notion of the drive also being inflected with racism, because on the one hand, I can see how unconscious desire is producing these sort of acts of racism through this kind of resentment or anxiety about this other sort of jouissance. But on the other hand, I see the drive, and maybe I'm wrong in the way that I read the drive, as sort of being antagonistic to that kind of wholeness. So I'm wondering is how you see the drive working to support that very fantasy of, in the particular example, whiteness.
Yeah, I think the drive is ultimately about excess, right? The drive does not want the object that represents wholeness, but it yet still circles it. What the drive wants is death. It wants self-destruction, right? And so what you see in, you know, in the what you see in the U.S. context with white nationalism, for example, is the 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 storming of the Capitol, right? This is our house, right? That's the chant. This is our house. You've taken something from us. You've robbed us of something that belongs to us, and we will make our house whole, right? So, what is articulated is a desire for wholeness. It's a desire for unity. It's a desire to make whiteness great again, right? But how do you do that? You do that by destroying the house. And so you have the circling of the drive around race, but it's not a drive that's aimed at the object of completion. It's a drive that ultimately is aimed at self-destruction.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Right. Ben.
Hi. I just wanted to ask what's quite just a political question that's not particularly psychoanalytic, but in terms of the historical accounts of how whiteness was constructed, if you're looking at, like, you know, the histories of things like the Bacon Rebellion in the, whenever that was, the late 17th century or whatever, in the States, and how you know, fine, there's all manner of complexities within all of this, but there are certainly accounts which would see the way that whiteness previously didn't exist. Blackness did, but it wasn't kind of galvanized into this great kind of phantasmatic opposition between these two great blocks. And that was a divide and rule strategy, because white laborers and black laborers who just happened to be white and happened to be black were getting together, and the colonial elites in the States at that time, whatever, they were like, let's cause some trouble here. And so white privilege as such was not really what anyone would call privilege these days. It was that your working conditions were a little bit better, but then, you know, slavery was then justified through these routes, and all sorts of legal adaptations were made and so on. To the degree that then the surplus enjoyment within that context of class is one which actually just is, you know, surplus of surplus capital that is the profit of the capitalist class. You know, clearly there's this kind of materialist reading. I mean, fine, once these great blocks within the symbolic order are there, all manner of phantasms and so on kind of weave their way around this stuff, and it turns into the kind of the situation we now have. But to what degree do you think that, in a way, I don't know, returning surplus to the surplus of material gain, as opposed to the surpluses of jouissance, to what degree does class have any purchase on reformulating things so that to cut against the whole racialized discourse? I mean, these days class sort of doesn't massively function in a lot of people's way of thinking about things compared to when Lacan was talking. And clearly that time in the 70s, you know, there's a big reference to Marxism going on in thinking. I just wondered what you thought, whether you thought about that, what you think the possibilities of the politics that takes it away from this into something else, and whether class still has any purchase on that.
So the question is whether or not it would be better to think of this in relation to class, or whether or not thinking of it in relation to class changes how we understand it.
I mean, obviously, through the 20th century, kind of left-wing politics, there was a fairly difficult relationship, in a way, between kind of orthodox Marxists who just asserted class the whole time and said race wasn't something to be thought about, and then people going, no, we have to see race as being a dimension of class or all kinds of things. But I just wondered, in what way do you see, I mean, the sexual relation is something which is ahistorical, that there is no sexual relation. That's kind of primordial within human subjectivity. Race like this is actually a historical artifact, so we understand. Yeah. I just wondered, in what way do you think now we've got it, we're stuck with it, it's all these phantasms are here, or do you think actually in some way returning it back into the discourses from which it first arose, the material conditions from which it first arose, what can be done?
So in my first book, Trauma and Race, I talk about there's this moment in the other side of psychoanalysis, the seminar, Other Side of Psychoanalysis, in which Lacan talks about the trafficking of ships. And he defines the trafficking of ships as the birth of capitalism. But the trafficking of ships was also the birth of slavery, right? It's also tied to the birth of slavery, to the slave ship itself. And Lacan talks about this trafficking of ships in order to describe a moment in which jouissance becomes, he says, calculable. It becomes possible to calculate one's relationship to jouissance through capital. My suggestion is that slavery becomes a method through which individuals calculate their relationship to jouissance. And what slavery allowed was not only fantasies of racial superiority, but also certain class structures. Specifically in the US, it enabled the possibility for a genteel class to emerge in the South, who were not only members of a superior race, but also members of a superior class. And so owning a slave or owning multiple slaves meant you were a gentleman. So the two intersect. And they intersect in a particular historical moment, right? There's nothing natural about it. That doesn't mean that it's easy to change, though.
Thanks, Sheldon. Thanks, Ben. Bracha, nice to see you here this evening.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Sheldon. It was terrific lecture. And I'd like to ask something and also clarify something. There is an aporia, which comes in a lovely way in the lecture, where you start with that a certain possibility and impossibility, and you end up saying, but we guys and girls have to take into account that there is also a subjective position. I think the first remark will be that indeed, if we compare to gender, we remain on the question of identity. And therefore somebody else can tell you your identity, fix you into identity. The symbolic is going smoothly with questions of identity. The subject feels uneasy. And with the sardine example of the object A, one of the things is that the object A looks at me and tells me something about my desirability or non, and how I then interiorate it. And since you took it from the formula of sexuation, then if we look at it from there, then there is this discrepancy, and again, between men, women, gender. All this is a lot to clarify in Lacan. It's not like he closed the question. But there is that question, when I'm classified this or there, or out of this, or out of existing of that, and the feminine. And I think then that feminine has this surplus about our body and the way we feel our body, that when I feel pain, you will not tell me I don't feel, I feel pain. I mean, as my body feels pain or is going to die. So this discrepancy between identity, gender, race, whatever, and whatever it is that we want to say that comes also from a subjective position we don't want to renounce. So if I take it even to the last question, how does this commercialize or economize? There's also the parallels, because, you know, when 2000 years ago, it was decided that the woman is a sinner and therefore she will suffer when she gives birth. That's what God said to Eva. You tempted man with an apple and now you will suffer. You will have pain when you give birth and men will rule you. And since that, for 2000 years, in most of countries that I know of, men write the law. And so you take upon something and economize it in terms of hierarchies and who decides and who will tell you what to do, and slavery of women also. She will do all the work that is unpaid. She will never study. She will not go to university before 1940 something, we forget. But there's a lot of things to, I think it's fantastic to ask the question of race through the formula of sexuation and what psychoanalysis is doing with that. And to that, I would like to add, to ask you what you think. Because in my understanding of the formula of sexuation, finally, if I want to address, so what is it that will jump over this aporia? How I, as a woman, as a female human being who want to be a woman, feels, and what is woman supposed to be, and the identity, this, that there is a way of saying maybe it's time to go beyond the formula, that all of them, the masculine and the feminine, have been presented from the masculine angle, in which there is a proposition. What is object A? Objet little a is not only that which escapes the phallic symbolic order, but it is also what is defined by it. So if it's defined by it, we are up to saying all of those four has a problem when we want to address the real of a body that can be killed because somebody sees a sign in it, whatever. And the body that I have always been, you know, I had my jouissance in that body. And jouissance in the Lacanian sense, which is not just joy, but also suffering. That's where I suffered. This is what I was addressed. I was addressed in the most tender age and in my unconscious in ways that I'm not going to deny. I want to be aware of. I don't want to deny. Because if everything of this is wiped for myself, I will be deprived of my most delicate and tender and vulnerable access to the universe, to see what I mean?
Yeah, so I would say two things. I think, you know, part of what you're getting at is the value of the formulas and the limitations of using the formulas. I think psychoanalysis has ignored race. So my central effort here is to insert race at the center of what is most exciting and most interesting about Lacan. And to show that
the late Lacan, which is indeed the late Lacan,
right,
sexuation and after.
Right, and to show that, you know, race is central to understanding the subject, right? And you know, Lacan
Yeah, I'll add to it. You know, because he says at a certain point, what is this object A? I indeed put it in the other, and I assume that he enjoys something that I'm unable to enjoy.
Right.
And because of that, I relate to him all kind of fantasies, and I'm going to kill him because he enjoys a way of being in a language which I cannot enjoy. And this is very murderous, and this is about race.
Yes, exactly so. And in terms of, the experience of the body, one of the things I focused on is trauma specifically from the perspective of race. And so that's why, it's interesting to think of feminine sexuality from the perspective of race. And, I just feel like that work just hasn't been done. There's been exciting work that's been done with sexuality in relation to these formulas, right? But, the movement there, of course, is to think past the formulas and think past the limitations of the formulas. But when nothing has been articulated by race, it's like—
Good entry. That's a fantastic point of departure.
You have to start there, and then and then the next step is what happens when we think about race and sexuality together, right? How do things become even more complicated?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's also the perfect place to end the discussion there. Thank you so much, Sheldon. Sheldon, I wonder, before we stop, if you could say a few words about the edited collection that's coming out. It's out in a few weeks, I think.
Yeah, definitely in a couple of weeks. We don't know exactly when, but next month it's edited by me and Derek Hook. We have 14 essays, I believe, in the collection, contributions by Hilary Neroni, Todd McGowan, Patricia Garavici, Gautam Basu Thakur, a slew of people with a focus on the title of the collection is Lacanian Race. So we talk about everything from Afro-pessimism to post-colonialism to the intersection between Fanon and Lacan. I really think it's breaking new ground. It's important work. It's actually available for pre-order on Amazon right now, and also on the Routledge website. It's part of the Psychology and the Other book series. And Derek Hook and I, along with Gautam Basu Thakur, will actually be putting together a colloquium that will be a part of the Psychology and the Other conference, which will be held September 17th to the 19th. We've put together 9 panels that are focused on Lacan, Fanon, and race. And we also have a keynote by a guy you may have heard of by the name of Homi Bhabha. So should be really exciting. I encourage all of you guys to listen in.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sheldon. And thank you for a really, really wonderful and I was going to say thought-inspiring, more thought-pushing talk tonight. I think, certainly speaking for myself, I've got a lot to go away and think about after that, which is really what these talks are all about. So thank you so much. We have events lined up from now until Christmas, so we will shortly be having events lined up post-Christmas. So we're going to stop for the summer recess. In September, we have Jameson Webster joining us, and then in October we have Hilda, I've forgotten Hilda's surname, Hilda Fernandez, and then in November we have Bracha Ettinger joining us. So please, if you've not already signed up to our mailing list, please do check back on our websites frequently and see updates for what's going on, and hopefully see you all back here in September, including yourself, Sheldon. Thank you very much for tonight.
Thank you, guys.